And we're going to finally get into the parables today. Right? Thank you. We took a 2-week break, 2 Sundays, just to process suffering and who God is. And we first looked to God with us in the flesh of Jesus during that 2-week break as the God who actually spent more than 90% of his time on earth simply coexisting with us, not doing miracles, not flashy and exciting, but simply living a common life that wasn't even worth writing about in the Gospels. He co-suffered with us 10 times more than he ever preached at us or did great miracles for us. 10 times more of his life was just simply co-suffering. Jesus' cruciformed life, when taken in its entirety, it shows us a God who does the occasional miracle, but more often than not, simply co-suffers on the journey of our life in the most prevalent moments that we will actually face, just common day-to-day times, when we don't see something extraordinary and worth writing about. We closed last week with a consideration of this. Jesus did not come to suffer so that I don't have to suffer. Jesus came to suffer because I suffer. And now in the revelation of a co-suffering God and all that that means, I suffer differently. I suffer many of the same things, but I grow to suffer them differently. And we carried that to the church and what the church is meant to look like. We are Jesus's continued embodiment on earth, meaning that we carry forward his presence. We are now Jesus coming into the world to suffer because the world suffers. And as we are co-suffering Jesus to the world, others will come to see the co-suffering God so they can then suffer differently like us. We're a cruciformed church, exemplifying the cruciformed life of Jesus. And we're turning now in Matthew from the Christ book of chapters 1 through 12 to the church book that makes up the rest of the gospel. We closed a few weeks ago with Matthew chapter 12. And if you'll put up my title slide, the first slide, Solomon, and then I can control the rest of them from here. As we go into this is the title for today: The Mob and the Parables. And so Jesus told us who his family is. And no, his family is not the mafia. The mob in this case does not refer to that. But at the close of chapter 12, he tells us who his family is. And this is the transition in Matthew to then speaking about the church, Jesus' family. And it should be noted here that we should pull Christianity back from what is often a master-slave theology. The metaphor of a master and slave is how we can sometimes picture how we work in the family, serving the family business, which again is not a mafia joke. Master and slave language has too often been used to tear us down and make us feel worthless, because it has been spoken of as this is how it is in the kingdom. It's simply a metaphor for a facet of how things are as we serve the kingdom. But the reality of the kingdom, what is spoken of as the reality, is that the kingdom is family, not master and slave. As I am made under all the bits in me that the sword of Jesus' word is looking to kill off for me, from me, I'm priceless. I'm a child of God. And so we've set the tone of the church as Jesus ends to speak of family. And we move into the church. we go to Matthew 13, 1 through 3. And I guess my thing's not going to work. So next slide, Solomon. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he had to get into the boat. And he sat there on the boat while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, listen, a sower went out to sow. And we don't go any further right now. We can leave this up as we consider this passage. In Matthew 11, we read that Jesus thanked the Father that the things of God and God's kingdom were hidden from those who held themselves as the powerful, the leaders, those who would co-opt the kingdom for their own gain. In Jesus' world, in Jesus' work, kingdom things, God things, had been withheld from those with power, rather than joining to those with power. So now the crowds come to Jesus, and what does he do? He starts speaking in parables. This is his time to shine. And he passes it by speaking in ways that are not easy to figure out. The way you gain a crowd is by putting on the show and then speaking to the lowest common denominator that everybody can gather around and is easy to understand. And Jesus doesn't do it. He doesn't win over the crowd. Jesus has thanked the Father that his ministry, it bypassed the choice of seeking to join to political power. But now, as the common people have surrounded him, Jesus bypasses another chance for another kind of power, mob power. Jesus is grateful to have bypassed the co-opting leaders of his day, but neither will Jesus become a co-opter himself. He will not ride the wave of mob power. The kingdom of God will not be given to those who hold positions of world power, and neither will Jesus rise to power upon the greatest tool of the world for power, the mob. And Matthew shows that Jesus' disciples realized the opportunity that he passed up. We go on to Matthew 13:10, if we can put that slide up. Jesus' disciples ask him, it says, then the disciples came to him and they said, why do you speak to them in parables? In other words, they're like, teacher, we had them by the scores. This was our chance to force change. We had the mob ready to have our back. Why did you ruin it with confusing words? And in Matthew, he records Jesus' response. He says that he told parables because these people were seeing but not perceiving. They are hearing, but they are not listening. He says these are people who are not understanding. Jesus says in this chapter of Matthew that he does not tell the parables to keep the people from understanding, but that when faced with a misunderstanding mob, Jesus must move to parables. Jesus can't give clear words to the mob because they cannot clearly receive his words. Plain words to a misunderstanding mob is a dangerous thing. If Jesus spoke plainly that the kingdom is here and I am the expected savior, the misunderstanding mob would seek through mob power to lead the overthrow on earth of the Romans and to make Jesus king. Jesus doesn't avoid clear words to make the crowd misunderstand. Matthew records that the misunderstanding crowd cannot be trusted with clear words because they can't understand them. And the mob would hijack the words the same as the leaders would have if the message was allowed to fall into their hands. So Jesus speaks in parables as he refuses to ride the wave of mob power. However, it is not that Jesus is refusing any single person there. He's refusing the them not the you. He's refusing the mob mind. Jesus shows time and again that with the individuals, he will work with them. And we see here and there that one and another breaks off from the many, they break off from the mob, and they come to Jesus, and Jesus meets them. But when misunderstanding people come in the wrong power dynamic as a political power or a mob power, Jesus switches to parables. This is generally what you will find through the Gospels is when Jesus is telling a parable, there's a Pharisee, there's a political leader, or there is mob power present. Jesus switches to parables because complexity disarms the powers of this world. Political power and mob power runs on simplicity. When a politician tells you it's really rather simple, and they're getting ready to point the finger at the one who is obviously the problem because it's so simple. And it's so simple because things would be okay if that one simply lost power and we had power. It's that simple. When the politician goes into the sales pitch of simplicity, look out, because you're being invited into being co-opted to join the mob. Jesus removes the fuel of perceived simplicity that feeds the power of the politicians and the mobs by turning to the complexity of parables. It disarms power, but invites anyone to think deeply, to discover Jesus' meaning when they realize that suddenly I'm confused. The parables invite those who were not seeing to see that they are not seeing. And too often these parables are treated today as many of us would view 2 plus 2. Christians essentially scoff at the simplicity of what they perceive to be held in the parables of Jesus. The way they're presented today makes us wonder how they even stumped anyone back then. The meaning seems so clear to us. But I'd like to suggest to you today that if we think we understand a parable with ease, we have probably missed its meaning completely. Even in his explanations later of the parables to his disciples, what we find is that Jesus really doesn't offer any clarity to his disciples. His answers are non-answers. His answers are confusing in and of themselves, and they still require wrestling. Jesus doesn't simply provide an answer key. And next week, we're going to look into that more. But for now, at the end of the parables, and then Jesus explains them to his disciples. Jesus then asks his disciples, do you understand? And they say, yes, we get it. And when we read on, no, they don't. But Jesus lets them sit in thinking that they got it. He doesn't care to correct them because actually getting a concrete answer from a parable is not the point of a parable. Knowing the answer to the parable is not the point. Wrestling with the parable is the point. And if we truly wrestle with the parables, we will often find that our initial clear answer of what it meant was wrong. And we may find that we realize we'll actually never figure out what the answer really is. That's the secret of parables. If we'll move past our most natural first understanding. The secret of the parables is what they do to us, not the answer they give us. Wrestling with the parables shapes us, and it reveals things about ourselves. We see ourselves more for who we are when we reflect on the thought that was the initial clear answer and what that says about us. We also learn more about ourselves as we see that when the parable takes us past our first answer, how uncomfortable do we begin to come? But if we'll let the parable carry us into discomfort, the parable will shape us, whether we find an answer or not. Jewish parables were not meant to be easy. They were meant to be hard to understand, to stir deep thought, and very often they were not meant to even have an answer. They were meant to be open-ended. If I come to the parables of Jesus and I dismiss them as clear and absolute, so obvious, then I must think that Jesus was an abysmal rabbi. Or I must think that Jesus is so simple-minded that what he meant as complex and amazing is laughably simple to me. But if I approach the parables ready to dismiss my natural answer to them, or maybe the second natural answer that comes after the first, then I'm ready to begin approaching the parables. We need to trust Jesus and distrust our easy answers. When we tell Jesus that his brain stumpers suck because they really aren't that hard and they're kind of obvious, we might need to listen again to what we just told Jesus. This chapter of parables makes up the heart of Matthew's gospel. This is the center. And it's interesting that he makes the heart of his gospel words that require work and lack clarity, rather than making the heart of his gospel the clearest words of Jesus. The heart of Matthew's gospel is material that creates the work and effort of wisdom, not simply providing an answer key. So we turn to the first parable, and there is so much to wrestle with in the material, but we're going to scratch the surface. We're going to read, if we go on to the next slide, Matthew 13, 3 through 9. Matthew 13, 3 through 9, I have it up here. It's small, but I'm just going to leave it up here for you guys to see. It says, "And he told them many things in parables, saying, 'Listen, a sower went out to sow seed. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they didn't have much soil. And they sprang up quickly since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. And since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. If you have ears, hear.'" We're going to put up the next slide that compares what we just read to the explanation of Jesus that's later on. And so the seed, Jesus says, is the word of the kingdom. The soil is a person's heart. The path where the seed can't penetrate, it just bounces off. The path is the hard heart. And the birds that come and steal the seed, it's the evil one. The rocky is the heart that is too cluttered for seed to grow deeply. Weeds is a heart with anxiety and deceptions of the world that are competing with the seed and eventually choke it out. And the good soil is the heart that is ready to receive the word of the kingdom. Now here's how I was taught to read it. The gospel is the seed. This is the plain, clear explanation. The one that I question. The gospel is the seed. The seed goes out to the people. It's thrown out. Some choose to harden their hearts against the gospel, and they refuse to let it sink in. Some, they grab onto a bit of the good thing about the gospel, but they don't really make room in their heart for everything, and so it can't root in their heart. Some receive the gospel, but they also choose to bring things into their life from the world. And those things compete against the gospel until it chokes out the gospel. And finally, some receive the gospel and they soften their hearts to it. And they let it sink in and take root. And they live happily ever after. It's simple, right? This is the simple explanation. We like simple because it gives power to us and we feel a sense of mastery. I have mastered the parable. And everybody's response to the gospel is on them. I just throw the seed. So let's run with this idea for now. Our hearts are the soil, and the bad hearts are not conducive to receiving the seed of the gospel. And they're blamed for their poor condition. And the people are then determined to be at fault for not choosing to be saved, and so therefore they deserve to burn in hell forever. This is the simplicity with which I was taught this parable. You choose what kind of heart you have, and you choose your response to the gospel. Never mind that the parable on second inspection, third inspection, continual inspection, never mind that the parable is so much more complex than that. And Jesus doesn't make it solely the person's fault for not receiving the gospel. Let's start with the heart of the hard-packed path that cannot receive the seed. The seed bounces off of it. This is the heart of soil that has been so beaten down over time by numerous people trotting over it, stamping it underfoot, that it's hard-packed for the seed, and the seed can't break through. And as the seed bounces off a heart that has been crushed underfoot by numerous people, the evil one comes and steals the seed off of the heart. The heart loses the seed that is too beaten down to receive anyway. Of all of the hearts, we look at this one in the parable as probably the most portrayed as a victim. This is someone who we might begin to feel compassion for rather than judging them as a perpetrator for rejecting the gospel. They have been trodden underfoot by other human beings. The next heart is rocky, and they realize that they really like parts of this gospel, but with so many obstacles in their hearts, the rocks, the gospel can't really find a place to sink in deeply. This means that when hard times come that focus down in oppression on a poorly rooted plant, the gospel withers and dies. And the Greek word here says that the person stumbles. They no longer walk in the gospel because the gospel has died under oppression. Now, this is a heart that seems to have had a chance because it was not being trampled so hard by others. So is the person solely to blame for a rocky heart? Well, we can ask ourselves, who puts the rocks in the soil of our heart? Certainly it can be us. But can an angry father put a rock or two in our heart so that the gospel struggles to find root in us because the root of a good father finds it difficult to take root through the rocks given to us by a bad father? Can enduring an abusive relationship throw a bunch of rocks into our heart that make it difficult for the root of unconditional love to gain traction in our heart? For the soil of many hearts, the world just backs the dump truck up and dumps the rocks on. If we think on it, it may not be as simple as what this has been presented to me in the past. The next heart is the soil also infested with weeds that kill off the gospel. Are we to blame this person entirely for the weeds? Again, we might say that the person is a factor. But Jesus also says the weeds come from being deceived, making the person with weeds also a victim. And finally, the heart of good soil is the amazing Christian who grabbed onto the seed of the gospel, and it could grow because they chose for it to grow. But pat most of them on the back and congratulate them for choosing good soil to be in their heart. And they will more often than not tell you, oh, it wasn't me. God met me at the right time in a special way, and he did the work. So very often, believers won't take sole credit for the gospel flourishing in us, but many will essentially place sole responsibility on the ones who who reject the gospel. Are we even talking about the gospel here, though? How it actually reads is that the seed is the word of the kingdom, not the gospel of the kingdom. If Matthew or Jesus had wanted us to know that the word of the kingdom was not the actual seed, but the seed was the gospel of the kingdom, they could have said so. 3 times through Matthew's gospel, he uses the exact words, the gospel of the kingdom. So he could have said that, but he doesn't. And this is the only time that Matthew or Jesus chooses a different word here. They speak a different word, maybe to maintain linguistic variety. Or if we believe that Matthew or Jesus, having access to a language that is often much more descriptive than our own, if we believe that they intentionally chose the language here to distinguish this as something different from the gospel of the kingdom, then the seed might not be the gospel of the kingdom. The seed is the word of the kingdom. Is the gospel something else? I believe the word of the kingdom is more than just the gospel of the kingdom. At times, the word of the kingdom, for those who need to hear it, might be the gospel of the kingdom. But the word of the kingdom is not limited to the gospel. Many times, even before hearing the gospel of the kingdom or after hearing the gospel of the kingdom, we need to hear many words from the kingdom. What this means is that Jesus' parable moves from no longer us versus them, as I look at myself as good soil who has accepted the seed of the gospel, and look at them who have chosen poorly. They hardened themselves against the seed, or they let it die off. If we consider the seed is the word of the kingdom, if the seed is all the words of the kingdom that come to any of us at any time in our lives, including believers, then this parable always applies to us. And depending on where the seed is cast into my heart, it can find any type of the soil within this parable. Any word of the kingdom can be cast into the field of any church. If there's only believers in a church and the word is cast out from the kingdom, across all believers, it will land on some and flourish in ready soil. But in others, it will bounce off and be stolen from us because it lands where my own heart is still damaged from being trodden upon and isn't ready to receive it yet. In others, the seed will encounter rocky ground or weeds, where we, even as believers, have yet to be able to turn that soil into good. Different times of sowing different seeds or messages of the kingdom will find different soil in each of us. Different soils in each of us that aren't even our own fault at times. In this parable, things change when I realize I am the entire field made up of all the soils. At any given time that a new seed of the kingdom is being thrown out, I am either the person that ends up having the word stolen from me, or I am the person where the seed struggles to find root, or I am the person where the seed is being choked off by other things in my life, or I'm the person where the seed has landed in the place that was ready for it. Now, as I read this parable, I don't get to sit back and bask in believing that I am in the good soil and they are the damned who chose the bad soil. Now, I am all soil, and everybody else is all soils. And we, all humanity, are together in our hearts, conditions, plural, of many soils. And we, humanity, are united by all having areas that are receptive, unreceptive, and in between. And then, as we have considered the condition of the soil for our hearts, if we truly read this parable deeply, the condition of the soil of our hearts, we realize is affected by others. So now we realize that we are either negatively impacting the soil of someone else's heart or helping to prepare the soil of someone else's heart for whatever seed the kingdom may wish to sow in them at some point, whether they're believers or unbelievers. And I don't place blame on the one whose soil has been trampled hard by innumerable people. I don't place blame on the one who has the hard heart, because I realize that somewhere in me is the hard soil too, in my heart. So now I must consider, am I trampling down the soil of someone's heart? Am I the one being harsh or abusive to others and thereby dumping rocks into their soil? Am I the one who is running people off into the anxieties and deceptions of the world because they dislike being around me? You're going to hear the kids return in a moment. Even more, this parable stirs me to not blame others for the condition of the soil of their heart, because I realize I have the same thing. Rather, the parable proactively challenges me to ensure that everything I do is to improve the hearts of others. And I must now ask, am I doing all I can to soften through love the places in people's hearts that have been trampled hard? Am I doing acts of service to others to remove the rocks that have been placed into their heart? Am I enjoyable to be around so that others can find a place with me in what I believe is true rather than be pushed out in the deception of the world where it grows weeds in their heart? And when the soil is ready, if I'm meant to be the one, am I planting seeds of the words of the kingdom in others? Am I planting the seeds of the words of the kingdom, words that are mercy, words that are, I'm here to suffer with you? Maybe what I've shared today is how the parable is meant to be understood. Or perhaps the meaning of the parables are impossible for us to know with certainty. They're possible to know with certainty so that we are driven to trust the voice that speaks them rather than trusting our mastery of the words. That's something we'll explore next week, as we'll also see Jesus' dry humor in this chapter. It's cryptic. Did what I share with you, was that the meaning of the parable? I believe it is a meaning. It has certainly shaped me. We'll see what next week holds. I get to end cryptically because Jesus has given us cryptic parables, and I get to be like my rabbi.